there are going to be attack vectors, and there's going to be this notion of privilege and trust. And this is something that we, security consultants have been arguing about the usefulness of for some time, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of our frustration with regard to trust and privilege. These things we'll actually find are kind of less useful than this thought process over here. But they're the things people routinely consider when they consider threat models. I converted a lot of my diagrams to scaling EPSs, so they should be more readable than this. If you're having trouble understanding, please just yell out some aspect of it and I'll explain it more fully. We'll find that, though, we have a few different kinds of annotation that we're going to add to these diagrams to show things. And for those of you, how many people have been participating in a design review or some sort of architectural analysis of the software, or maybe even security design? Okay, a lot. So we'll find that different ways of picturing this, the structure of the software will actually illuminate different things that we should test for. In my mind, this will help us drive security testing, drive code review, drive fuzzing, further analysis. And I'm going to show you a bunch of different things you can throw at the diagram, whether they be color overlays or little stars or something you can put in boxes to point out to yourself where interesting stuff will occur. One way to think about threat modeling in a sentence is, if you have 1 million lines of code in your application, it's a fairly decent sized application finally, where are the pieces that you would look at if you only had 5 days to look at it in order to find where the problems are most likely going to occur? That's what we're after. And the high impact problems. With regards to threats themselves, remember I talked about them being a who, not a what or an attack. And that's important because I work a lot more probably with developers than I work with security guys. And this is a completely non-functional relationship that we have between security guys and developers, in my opinion. We need rules of engagement. And in my mind, defining who you're willing to think about attacking your system are a big part of that rules of engagement. So if insiders are off the table, they're off the table. Developers should use and reference threat models to get the security guys off of their back when they come up with some whiz-bang, crazy, ridiculous attack that your organization is not interested in, or that you have compensating controls in place to take care of, whether they be completely off axis like insurance or liability transfer or contracts, or actually technical compensating controls like a proxy that's going to force authentication and things like that. So we want to think about who, and we want to think about in terms of capabilities and skill levels, and the resources and tools they have available to them. We want to define what this person could do to the system. We're also going to want to talk about motivation, but I'm going to treat that separately. In any rules of engagement, we have to figure out what the capabilities of the people we're willing to protect against are. I've done high-end assessments for some of my clients, and we've gotten down these rabbit holes and everyone in this room has probably asked or answered this question. So I have to use credentials to connect to the database. Where am I going to store these things and how on my web server, right? Is there anyone here that hasn't, faced that question in some form or another? So you get down these rabbit holes talking about whether or not someone could reverse engineer a config file, whether they could own a host. You need to figure out who you're protecting against so that you can answer questions like whether or not that question is worth answering quickly. So are we talking about someone who has access to servers in a particular network zone? Are we talking about someone with reverse engineering skill? Oftentimes when you get to the bottom of that rabbit hole in a conversation with someone, you end up talking about someone who needs NSA level reverse engineering skills, infinite time, and the ability to operate and look at your systems without being detected for months at a time. And when I think about that kind of threat, I'm thinking about concerted professional attack or foreign government. And I submit to you that if you're a company attempting to protect against your own government, you're in a different business than I'm familiar with working at. And so those are things you can just take off the table. So thinking about this notion of and so when you ask questions about, okay, well, what do we have to do to the config file? for this application or this web container. Think about the capabilities it would take in order to get access to them. And you'll start to come up with equivalence classes for things pretty quickly. We'll talk about that in a bit. Just documenting these is an important exercise, and it's a little bit draconian, but you really only have to do this maybe once or a few times, depending on how disparate the business units in your organization are. In my mind, this is a task best done by the central security office, the corporate security office. They have the best view of what all the business units are going to need to consider. And in some sense, they may actually be able to talk about threats being pertinent to one business unit or another, and not all of them. This is going to help us, when we've characterized someone's capabilities and their skill levels, it's going to help us quantify their motivation for misuse a bit. And it's going to help us figure out whether or not they're going to have at their disposal particular techniques. Again, the corporate security office should enumerate the threats of how, because they're defining what you have to think of to be thorough about considering threats. Developers should participate as stakeholders in this process because they need to be the bullshitometer, right? They need to prevent against the mission impossible threat scenario, where it's a 5-stage attack that requires inside information and wire work. Before I jump into the details of how we do this and how we've helped people do this, I wanted to kind of talk about the alternatives, because there are some out there, and it's important. I'd like to talk about Stride. Are people using Stride here? Okay, so a few. So in my mind, if you were going to boil down in a cheeky way what Stride is, it's a conceptual checklist backed with data flow diagrams. There's a few concepts. The conceptual checklist is basically the message digest of Ross Anderson's security engineering book, which is tremendous, and you should absolutely read it if you're doing secure design or doing architectural assessments. But Stride is basically the acronym for remembering those elements of that book, security engineering concepts that map easily to security controls. So if you're a government, semi-government, or non-profit organization, you're very into talking about attacks and controls. And when you think about spoofing, and when you think about tampering, you can think immediately, almost in knee-jerk fashion, about the controls that an application should provide in order to fix those. So this is a good start. But when you go from that conceptual level to this, now you're looking at something that a unit test writer would consume to write a particular test case or a set of test cases around a portion of a test document. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about the way that Microsoft works, because they're a massive software producer. So they have a development QA-oriented culture, and they're a product company. So when you think about applying a checklist of engineering concepts to a massive testing effort, that's going to make a lot of sense for Microsoft. If you're a product company, I recommend looking at things like Stride, because they will fit your culture. If you're a bank, my guess is that you have a tenth of the security/QA people that are needed in order to get to the data flow diagram level and then build a comprehensive security test suite around it.